Hello everyone, welcome to my channel. Today we're going to talk about the history of the English language from the beginning until now. Ready? Let's go. The beginnings of the English language can be found in England. No surprises there. But the beginnings of the English language weren't in London or some other big city. It was in this tiny village called Ashdown. And if you want to visit it today, you can't, because since 1976 it has been underwater. It's when the government decided to make a reservoir there. But before that, in the 400s, the village existed. And it is where one of the first records of Old English was written, specifically the name of the village itself, which was written down by a monk named Beda in his book, called The Ecclesiastical History of the English People. He wrote that the village was called Aspen Down, meaning Aspen Tree Town in Old English. And he wrote that because, unlike most places in England, its name didn't change throughout history. But why is that important? Well, let me introduce you to a friend of mine who knows everything about names of places. Welcome, Atlas. So Atlas, what are all the languages that English has evolved from? Hi there. Okay, so English has two main ancestors, Germanic and French. Let's start with Germanic. This language came from a group of people called Anglo-Saxons and Jutes. They were three Germanic tribes from what is now Denmark and northern Germany, and they invaded Britain in the 5th century AD. At that time, Britain spoke a kind of Celtic language, but over the next few centuries, Old English gradually replaced it. Old English was spoken from around the year 450 until 1150, and during that time, a lot happened. For example, the settlement of Britain by Germanic tribes, the Viking invasions, the Norman conquest, the Black Death, and the Great Vowel Shift. But maybe those things didn't happen in Ashdown, though. Maybe only normal village life, like farming, making love, fighting, and eating pork. Well, actually, no. Even here, the history of England impacted people's lives. We have proof of that thanks to something called place names. Place names are one of the best ways of learning about history. That is because when someone new settles in a place, they usually change its name to something in their own language. So in the case of England, when the Germanic tribes arrived, they renamed a lot of places. For example, the Scottish name for Inverness is actually spelled in Gaelic and means the mouth of the river Ness. But when the English conquered it, they anglicized the name to Inverness. Now, this happened a lot when the Germanic tribes arrived in Britain, and that means that many of the old Gaelic or Romano British place names were lost. However, there are still a few left. For example, the name Avon is thought to come from an old Celtic word that means river, and many rivers in England have that name. Anyway, while Old English was being spoken in Ashdown, the villagers probably had to pay taxes to their lord. In medieval times, the king owned most of the land in England, and he divided it among a bunch of nobles who paid him taxes. And if you wanted to be a lord, having a good relationship with the king was important. And how did you do that? Well, often by giving him money. And where did that money come from? Well, mainly from the peasants that worked your land. Anyway, at that time, the king wasn't called the king. He was called the King's English, the king's son. And that name comes from the Danish word konungur, meaning king. And that's not surprising because at that time, Danish Vikings had settled in northern England. So that's where the name stayed. But how about the name England? Well, that comes from a different Germanic word, Engla-land, the land of the Angles, referring to one of the three Germanic tribes that had invaded the island. So anyway, back to the villagers in Ashdown. When they paid their taxes to the king's son, they would have used bar-off silver. Back then, coins weren't really used. Instead, people carried around silver bars and cut them into pieces based on how much they needed. So if you wanted to buy something for 5 pieces of silver, you'd cut 5 pieces off a bar and hand it over to the merchant. What's that got to do with the English language? Well, that system led to a lot of words in English, starting with the letters B and P, for example. The word pound, which originally meant a unit of weight equal to 40 silver pennies. That's where we get the name pound sterling from. Or the word price, which originally meant a payment made in kind, usually in the form of labor or produce, but sometimes in the form of money. And we also get the word penny from the Latin word ponderium, meaning weight. There were also words for amounts of wheat, wine, and ale, as well as for lengths of time and distances. All of these were useful for trading. Speaking of trading, if the villagers of Ashdown ever wanted to trade with someone from France, they'd need to learn Norman French, because that was the dominant language of international business at the time. and that's where a lot of English vocabulary comes from. For example, words like asset, art, danger, debt, prison, and velvet. And don't think that just because you speak English you wouldn't be understood in France. Here in my hometown, people speak a local dialect called Gallo, which is basically a mix of French and the neighboring Italian dialects. Da. And when I speak it, people understand me without a problem. But if I tried to do business with someone from nicer Paris, they wouldn't understand me because my accent is too strong. They would understand me if I spoke standard French, but I don't know that language, so I'd have to learn another language. That's how it was in medieval England. That's why English changed so much. When William the Conqueror invaded and won the Battle of Hastings in 1066, he and his soldiers brought their language with them. A lot of Old English words were replaced with Norman French ones. Some Old English words were replaced with Latin words from the scholars in the monasteries, and some Old English words were replaced with words from Scandinavian languages from the Vikings. To show you how big the vocabulary gap was, here's a sentence in Old English and the same sentence in modern English. Look at how many words have changed. Lo, I am speaking to you from England. Haforic, icy spreken, to Docker Englolandi. And that brings us to Middle English, which was spoken from 1150 to 1485. During that time, England had a civil war, the Peasants' Revolt, the Black Death, the Great Famine, and the 100 Years' War, and literature flourished. Geoffrey Chaucer wrote Canterbury Tales, one of the most important works in English literature, and during that time the great vowel shift occurred. What was that? Well, basically, the pronunciation of vowels began to change throughout England, and the shift affected the long vowels more than the short ones. And it's probably connected to the introduction of printing, because when people began reading printed text, they probably read it in the way they heard it. And if the pronunciation of vowels was changing, that meant that the written language had to change too. Anyway, moving on to early modern English, which was spoken from 1485 to 1800. And it began with the famous line from Henry VIII, and it continued through the reigns of Elizabeth I, James I, Charles I, Oliver Cromwell, and finally ended with Queen Victoria. During that time, England became a world power, explored the New World, created new financial systems, experienced the Renaissance, the Reformation, the Industrial Revolution, and saw the first coffee houses, newspapers, and public schools open. Many scientists and writers lived during that period, such as William Shakespeare, Christopher Marlowe, John Milton, Francis Bacon, Isaac Newton, Charles Darwin, and many others. During early modern English, the language split into two varieties, British English and American English. This was because in 1492, Christopher Columbus reached the United States and started a migration of English people to the New World. Also, American English is sometimes considered its own language, but I think it is more of a variety because most people can understand both British and American English. And finally, we arrive at modern English, which began in 1800 and continues today. During this period, the British Empire reached its greatest extent, and many people started speaking English in Asia, Africa, and Oceania. English also replaced Latin as the language of science and scholarship, and English took the place of Greek as the language of diplomacy and commerce. If you want to learn more about the differences between British and American English, you should watch this video. Anyway, that's the story of the English language from the time it was spoken in a little village called Ashdown until today. Did you learn anything new? Leave a comment below. Remember to subscribe to my channel so you don't miss any of my videos. See you next time.